Welcome to the journey where forgotten pages speak. In your view, what shapes memory? More fact or folklore? Comment, fact or folklore, and tell us why. First light slices the frost, December 29th, 1890. Wounded Knee Creek soldiers ring a sick camp 4 guns wait. How does a promised disarmament become the breaking of a people? Snow hangs in the air like held breath, and the lodges of Miniconjou Lakota, with Oglala Lakota kin who fled after Standing Rock, settle into the shallow draw where wind moves close to the ground. Spotted Elk rides in a wagon, lungs burning with winter illness, the leader, the army calls Bigfoot. Children wake to the stiff rattle of canvas and the dull clink of metal, a morning music that does not belong to them. Across the rise, crews tend Hotchkiss mouths as if warming stovetops, their black shapes made simple by distance. Between these two lines, family and formation, lies a question older than the day when law says protection, but looks like a circle of rifles, which truth survives the hour. The stakes arrive with the light. For the people in the snow, it is life paired to breath and kinship. How fast a mother can gather a child, how steady a grandfather's hand can be when a soldier steps into the doorway, how a name spoken low can hold a soul steady. For the nation, it is land, and the paper that commands land, treaties wrung dry, allotments, measured out with cold rulers, a policy that claims to save by dividing. The ghost dance has been walking across prairies like a desperate prayer, stitched into steps, and the government has chosen to hear only thunder in its quiet drums. If the dance promised reunion and a world set right, the state answered with formations and a timetable. The camp is not a fort, and never pretends to be. It is a ledger of winter need, thin horses with ice on their flanks, pots blackened from guarded fires, a kettle steaming before the wind steals the heat. Men stack a few rifles, as told some rusted, from hard travel others kept close because scarcity makes every tool dear. An interpreter barks, officers confer in lines of clipped syllables, and the ground hard as hammered tin carries each sound farther than anyone intends. The people look toward Pine Ridge and a hoped-for peace with relatives among Oglala Lakota across a short map that feels longer each mile. What stands between them and that safety is not distance, but decision. Fear does its arithmetic with poor numbers. It counts rumors as facts and multiplies by pride, and soon the sum is an encirclement that pretends to be escort. The Seventh Cavalry still carries ghosts from Little Bighorn like stones in a saddlebag. And revenge is a poor counselor in winter. Up on the ridge, the 4 mountain guns do not blink. They are built for angles and arcs, not for judgment. Down in the draw, a man who does not hear well clutches a prized rifle because coin was hard to find, and dignity is not cheap. Hands tighten, a voice sharpens, and the day leans forward on its toes. What follows will be called, many names in many reports will be argued in halls, where warmth is guaranteed will be taught to children who deserve a truth with edges. But the heart stake does not change. A community seeking to live through winter meets a machine of policy that mistakes control for care, and a nation that claims law as its shelter must choose what its law is built to protect. Across the snow, the old world and the new stand face to face, and no one yet knows which will flinch first. To understand how a circle of lodges came to rest beneath the sights of iron, we have to step back before the first shout, before the first lanyard pull to the names, the trails, and the papers that set this morning in motion, who led, who followed, and who wrote the rules that narrowed a people into the mouth of a creek. Under the blue hard sky of the northern plains, the road to this winter morning was laid in 4 steps that moved like hoofbeats across years. First, the Fort Laramie world narrowed as the great herds were erased, and the agency ration became the hinge of life. Then the Dawes Act of 1887 took a knife to Lakota country, carving allotments that turned a nation into scattered squares and placed every movement under watch. After that, the ghost dance rose as a woven hope when bodies and spirits were thin, its circle promising reunion and a world set right, a prayer the government heard as a threat. Finally, on December 15, 1890, when Sitting Bull fell at Standing Rock, fear traveled south and west. Faster than any rider, and bands like the Miniconjou of Spotted Elk chose the only rational direction left toward kin at Pine Ridge, and the possibility of a softer dawn. The land around Pine Ridge is an argument between open and broken. Grass runs in cold sheets until the ground suddenly drops into ravines stitched with scrub and bone-white cutbanks. Wounded Knee Creek takes one of those seams and winds it into a shallow draw. Wood is scarce enough to be counted stick by stick. Water keeps moving, but never forgets the taste of clay. The buffalo that once wrote their black signatures across the horizon are gone, and with them the winter certainty that a hunter's skill could feed a camp. What remains are government-issue rations, thin and late, and the knowledge that a lodge must be light enough to flee and heavy enough to hold warmth. A people learns how to live inside contradictions, but every compromise costs a little blood from the center. Spotted Elk, called Bigfoot by soldiers and reporters, was not a man of clenched fist, but of open hands, known among Miniconjou Lakota for keeping balance when tempers ran, his medicine taken from a quiet authority that listened before it spoke. He was sick now, lungs seized by winter, riding in a wagon while others walked. With him were families from Cheyenne River country and a handful of Oglala Lakota who had drifted since Standing Rock broke the air. They were not an army and did not pretend to be. They were kin trying to find a safe circle at Pine Ridge where Oglala Lakota relatives could fold them in and where the agency's tight grip might ease beneath the eyes of allies. Across the line stood Colonel James W. Forsyth of the Seventh Cavalry, a professional who understood formations and the mathematics of force, who looked at the landscape through a sighting line and saw problems that yielded to discipline and artillery. His officers carried the old shadow of Little Bighorn in their saddlebags, and that memory tipped the scale in every judgment they made. With Forsyth came 4 Hotchkiss mountain guns that turned the ridge above Wounded Knee into a geometry lesson: elevation, angle, arc, impact. The government wanted a demonstration of mastery that winter, a clean proof that its law could touch any lodge on any day. Policy traveled as paper, but acted as weather. The Dawes Act of 1887, written in close script, far from this grass-forced allotments that fractured Lakota land and funneled authority through agents and police, turning ancient homelands into a grid and making every step subject to permission. In that grid, the ghost dance looked to officials like a storm front. To the people in the lodges, it felt like a medicine against hunger and sorrow, a way to stand upright in a thinning world. The Army read the song as signal. The singers meant it as repair. The December march to Wounded Knee was the last mile of these long choices. Soldiers intercepted the column near Porcupine Butte and herded it along the frozen road with the tidy vocabulary of escort. The camp pitched where the creek bends because the ground accepts a circle there, and because the wind for once runs low. Horses steamed, children slept, men stacked a few rifles under watchful eyes. Others held theirs back because loss had already taken too much. At Pine Ridge, just beyond a horizon that sometimes felt close enough to touch, there were relatives and a promise of order not built on fear. Between the draw and that hope stood the ridge with its guns, the officers with their orders, the interpreter with his clipped voice, and a set of assumptions hammered hard by a decade of policy. This is the cast as the sun rises, a sick but steady leader, guiding Miniconjou and Hunkpapa families toward kin. An army commander proud of precision, determined to tidy danger before it ripened. A land that magnifies every decision with ravines and wind. And a law that claims to be shelter but has learned to speak through confiscation. All that remains to be decided is what disarmament means when fear carries the measuring stick. The interpreter steps forward, the rifles are called for, and the ground itself seems to hold its breath as morning reaches into the lodges and the next choice comes due. Dawn does not arrive all at once on the prairie. It thins the dark until every shape is a rumor. The first rumor is safety. Soldiers say escort families hear custody, and the space between those words shrinks with the cold. Officers order the lodges set in a neat crescent by the creek, a geometry that pleases the guns on the ridge. Wood is counted stick by stick, and the kettles steam thin. A ration wagon is promised and then not seen. The interpreter moves from lodge mouth to lodge mouth, with the clipped certainty of someone who believes translation is a straight road, not a braid. The first incident is a parley that never settles. An officer asks for every rifle. Men bring a few, then more, then hesitate at the last. Some pieces are heirlooms or dearly bought on a bad year. Some are rusted from hard travel and mean more as dignity than as power. A gray-haired uncle lays one down with the heaviness of surrender. A younger cousin turns his shoulder to hide another under a robe. The stack grows into a small fence of wood and iron, and still the officer measures it with his eyes and finds it short. He sends squads to search the lodges. The search is clumsy. A woman's sewing bundle is upended. A child's pouch spills out trinkets and a single cartridge which suddenly feels like a fuse. A knife taken from a sleeping mat becomes a trophy in a soldier's hand. Words tighten, faces harden. The parley phrase? The second incident is weather. Cold bullies judgment and wind steals patience. Spotted Elk coughs until his voice is thin wire, his breath a white thread unraveling in the air. The old men keep their blankets close and blink against frost. Horses step carefully on glassy ground that will not forgive a slip. The sky lowers and threatens snow. Everyone knows what a blizzard does to the wounded and the old. The request to move on to Pine Ridge becomes a plea to outrun the storm, to fold into kin before the sky closes its fist. The officers consult a pocket of orders as if paper could warm a hand. They decide to wait for the morning to finish the disarmament and count. Waiting is a decision that sounds like nothing and feels like a trap. The third incident is tactical. Night falls with the 4 Hotchkiss guns already angled like patient jaws, crews hunched over breaches and fuses, the ridge scabbed with silhouettes. Sentries pace a circle around the camp, and the arc of hoofprints in the snow draws a hard boundary that every child can see. Cavalry companies shift positions at intervals, a choreography of control that reads as threat when you are the one inside the ring. Stories pass from lodge to lodge. Some say the troops are nervous because of the fight at Standing Rock 2 weeks earlier. Some say the 7th still rides with the echo of Little Bighorn in its ears. Some say neither. Reason matters because iron has its own logic. In the dark, a drum is tapped 3 times and then silenced. Even songs step lightly under watch. Morning tries to begin with quiet. Soldiers file into the camp in pairs, and an officer announces what he calls the simple plan. Rifles will be collected again, every blanket and bundle searched. Then the band will be escorted to the agency. The interpreter throws the words across the lodges like gravel. Men line up and sit. Women stand behind them with shawls wrapped tight. Children cluster at knees and stare at the ground as if it might open and offer them another place to be. A squad moves through with a wagon to carry what is taken. The army calls this prudence. In the camp, it feels like a stripping. There is a man who hears the world as if it is underwater. Some call him Black Coyote. He holds a Winchester close because it cost him dear coin, and because pride is one of the last currencies that cannot be rationed. 2 soldiers step toward him with hands extended. He pulls back. A sergeant barks. An officer demands. The interpreter translates the heat, but not the human, and a small crowd tightens. Hands close on the barrel. Someone shouts that the man cannot hear. Someone else shouts to take it anyway. The rifle wavers, and the whole morning leans forward. This is not yet the shot. It is the balance point where either side could step back and choose breath. Another knot forms near the stacked rifles. A medicine man moves among the seated men, with a voice low and steady reminding them that courage is a posture of the heart. Officers mistake the gesture for incitement. A soldier jabs with his carbine and the line flinches. A boy cries. A dog threads between legs and is kicked away. His yelp rips through the order. Searchers pull a hidden gun from a robe and hold it high, a priest wrenched from privacy. Its glint draws the eyes of the men whose hands are empty. Everything hovers. From the ridge, the artillery sergeant glances down and reads the camp as if it were a map. Guns are aligned. Elevation is set for the shallow draw. The crews stand with lanyards coiled like small snakes at their feet. The visual fact of 4 breaches open to the sky adds a weight that words can no longer counter. In the ring, a lieutenant's voice climbs a rung too high. The interpreter's mouth is dry. Spotted Elk coughs so hard that his whole body tilts. A corporal pushes for a rifle, and in the sharp tug the old Winchester jerks and detonates its held breath. Sound is a blade that makes copies of itself. The first crack is followed by the reflex reply of men drilled to answer echo with fire. Dust leaps from frozen ground, then snow, then canvas. For a heartbeat, the blast rolls through the camp like a hand overturning a table. The Hotchkiss crews reach down for lanyards by sheer schooling. Not yet, someone says. Now, another replies. The wedge between those 2 words is as thin as a fuse. And in the middle of the camp, a mother snatches a child and faces the ravine already measuring distance with her eyes. Later, an inspector general will write a letter and brand the thing that begins here with a name that cannot be softened. It was a wholesale slaughter of women and children. Nelson A. Miles, 1891. The sentence will travel farther than the snowfall and come to rest in halls that argue over what language can bear. But the men in the ring do not have the luxury of phrasing. They have the next breath, the next step, the briefest chance to choose a road that is not paved with iron. The rifles are up. The circle is a spark nest. The ridge with its patient guns seems to lean forward. Between the creek and the first rise, the path to Pine Ridge runs like a thin line of mercy that is about to be erased. What happens in the next handful of heartbeats will decide whether the morning remains a parlay or becomes a page that bleeds through the book. The moment after the old Winchester leapt, the air did not so much explode as decide. A line of soldiers jerked their carbines to shoulders and answered an echo with doctrine, a reflex drilled until it replaced thought. The first volley ripped gaps in the lodge walls, punched holes in kettles and canvas, and sent feathers and sage smoke into a twisting veil. Horses reared against picket lines, eyes, white breath smoking like engines. The line of seated Lakota men rose in the same heartbeat, the change in posture as involuntary as flinching at a blow. Some reached for the stacked rifles that were suddenly a mirage of safety. Others threw blankets wide to shield the children pressed behind them. A few bolted toward the shallow cut of the ravine where the creek bent out of sight, measuring the distance with the desperate mathematics of fathers and mothers. Terrain chose sides with ruthless speed. The camp lay in a shallow bowl that looked gentle until it focused fire like a cupped hand. The ridge on the north and west gave the Hotchkiss crews clean angles. The creek's banks offered a thin slit of cover if you could reach it before the next shell walked itself down the slope. The wind ran low, steady from the northwest, a small ally that carried smoke away from the gunners and into the faces of the people trying to flee. Snow packed underfoot gave little traction. Where men fell, they slid and left dark commas that the storm would later try to correct. Formation on one side meant companies wheeling by drills into an enclosing arc. On the other, it meant families turning in every direction at once, the grammar of survival, refusing the neat syntax of battle. The first Hotchkiss shell answered not to anger, but to the perfect geometry of sights and hand wheels. The gun captain threw his palm forward. A lanyard snapped tight. The mountain gun lifted and coughed. The recoil sled skidding back on its wooden trails, the trail spades biting through frost into frozen earth. The projectile described a simple parabola. The eye could almost trace an education in arc and time. And then the shell arrived in the center of a circle that had never been a battlefield until this second. Canvas lifted as if inhaled. The sound hit the valley a fraction slower than the metal, so that ears grasped the shape of the blow after bodies felt it. The second shell was already in the air. Belief did not vanish when iron began to speak. It changed shape. Men who the soldiers thought of as dancers remembered the small medicines they carried and the customs that had steadied them, in worse places a touch to the ground for courage, a murmur to the ancestors, a hand passed quickly over a child's hair, to call protection by its proper name. Some tried to sing the beginning of a phrase breaking into cough and smoke. The ghost dance had promised a world set right, a reunion where dead and living might walk one trail for a moment. That promise did not include instructions for a morning like this, but it did include a frame: do not break the circle of your humanity, even when others try to unmake it for you. In the space between shells, a grandfather lifted his palm and told those closest to him to keep their hearts quiet. The command was not about silence, it was about remaining a people. Tactics on the Army's side were textbook, and also treacherous to their own. Skirmishers spread in a rough crescent, but smoke from canvas and powder obscured lines of fire, and the shallow bowl echoed shots back with confusing vigor. When some Lakota men reached for the stacked rifles and fired low from the hip toward the ridge, the bullets struck not the guns, but the torsos of soldiers who had stepped in front of their own barrels. Horses tore free and thundered through the ranks, turning files into knots. Officers shouted ranges that made sense only in calm. Non-commissioned men tried to sort the chaos with kicks and the flat of hands. A pair of troopers sprinted to the stack of confiscated rifles and began hurling them into the creek, each splash a small gesture of control in a scene that no longer acknowledged the word. Down in the draw, the fight had no logic but breath. A hunk papa uncle threw himself sideways into the path of two children and dragged them toward the bank. He slid clawed at grass roots slick with frost and found purchase pushing the little bodies ahead, like bundles set on a sled. A young woman with a knife turned once like a dancer and slashed through a carbine sling that had become a noose around her brother's arm. The knife flashed again to cut open the back of a lodge, and for a second a small river of people poured through the new door. A boy hardly taller than the soldier's carbine barrel lifted a dropped revolver and fired it into the air, the report swallowed instantly by the greater weather of the guns. The act was not war, it was a protest that he was still here. The Hotchkiss crews worked with the professional calm of men who belonged to the god of procedures. Elevation and traverse were refined between rounds. The gunners stepped their fire left to right, then back again, stitching the bowl with iron in a pattern that would read as intention in every body it met. Each gun could throw 2 shells in a minute if the crews kept their nerves and their thumbs clear. They did. The mountain guns had been designed for places exactly like this, where a ridge gave advantage and a valley offered targets that could not easily run uphill. The shrapnel sheared tent poles into spears and burst cooking pots into coins. Where the shells struck close to the ravine, dirt and snow fountained into choking clouds that hid both those who fled and those who hunted them. And in that brief blindness, some families gained 3 or 4 more steps, which sometimes is the only arithmetic that matters. Ethics in that hour had to choose sides faster than law could spell its own name. Inside the ring, everything argued for the same conclusion. Whatever threat the army imagined, what lay in front of the muzzles was a community. Women ran with infants bound to boards strapped across their chests. Old men coughed and staggered and tried to keep their hands open so the soldiers could see they held nothing but age. Boys who had learned to bring wood and water on command fell with the awkward motions of children still growing into their limbs. The claim of self-defense, so often a reflex in reports written later, bent under the weight of what eyes actually saw. When riders chased figures across the whitening flat beyond the camp's far edge, their bullets stitched not a line of enemy skirmishers, but a series of running silhouettes that included skirts and braids and small shoulders. The cost was counted in relationships, not ranks. Shock peaked in places that would refuse to be named on official maps. At the mouth of the ravine where brush gathered, people piled into the thin cover, as if the earth had opened a sleeve. Soldiers firing from above could not see clearly who lay in the tangle, and fired anyway, the angle cruel and efficient. A man trying to rise with a child in his arms took a step and fell backward, as if the slope had become a wall. Another, climbing on hands and knees, kept his body between two small figures and learned at the top that protection has limits when iron is patient. On the far side of the bowl, a lodge caught and burned with a strange bright hiss as snow turned to steam on the canvas. The figure that staggered from its door carried a bundle that did not move. When she saw there was no cover, she knelt and rocked once, twice, then rose and walked straight toward the soldiers. The bundle held out like a truth. The line split around her and then closed. Some things cannot be described without betraying the trust of those who survived them. Some things have to be known anyway. The army lost men that morning too, mostly to their own fire or to bullets sent in panic from close, irregular range. A trooper went down, clutching the side of his head, the blood shocking against the white, and his friend looked at him longer than doctrine allowed. The pause as human as anything else that happened there. A lieutenant with a voice trained to cut through weather took a shell fragment in the thigh and sat down hard, astonished at how quickly authority bleeds out through torn cloth. Medics worked in the middle distance as if on a different stage, binding and dragging, while the guns kept their metronome. If a report later insisted on parity on the notion that both sides paid something like the same coin, the valley itself would object. It had the balance sheet under its skin. Timing finished what position began. The engagement lasted long enough for the first rush of adrenaline to burn off and for decisions to harden into practices. The guns slowed and then stopped when the targets became too scattered to justify shells. Small arms fire continued in uneven bursts as mounted men rode outward in wide fans to intercept anyone who had made distance across the flats. The wind freshened. The light shifted as cloud moved in heavy slabs over the ridge. The air tasted of iron and ash. Somewhere a bugle sounded, not because order had been restored, but because men who have been taught that sound equals control will always reach for a horn when their hands cannot tidy what they have made. When the smoke lifted enough to draw breath without coughing, the field showed its accounting. Lodges lay crushed like folded hats. Cook fires were smeared into black mirrors in the snow. The ravine was a gallery of stillness. Those who could still move gathered the wounded by reflex, more powerful than fear, lifting bodies that weighed more than their bones, because grief adds a number. Spotted Elk lay on the ground where the wagon had stood, motion finally conceding to winter and iron, and the stubborn drag of illness. He had moved his people as far as a man could against a storm of policy and pewter. The part of leadership that still mattered now would belong to those who chose whom to carry first. A storm rolled down out of the northwest with the punctuality of a fact. The first flakes were fat and aimless. Then the air crowded with white, and the world shrank to an arm's length. The army put up a rough perimeter and sent for wagons. The gunners leaned against their carriages and looked at their hands. Some soldiers took knives and cut open the pockets of the dead for cartridges or cherished small things they did not understand. Others, shaken down to the roots, turned their faces away. The ridge, so full of purpose an hour before now, looked like a rumor of itself. The creek kept moving under a film of ice as if refusing to memorize the names that had been spoken into it. Customs tried to resume in what little space remained for them. Women who could still stand began the quiet work of covering faces, of placing a hand on a chest, and speaking a name, of turning the dead, so they lay with a dignity that might survive a night in the open. Men who had learned the prayers for crossing said them under breath. The words did not stop the cold, but they arranged it, made it bearable by giving it a shape. A young man gathered a bundle of blankets and moved among the wounded, tucking, smoothing, pausing, while a sergeant watched and did not interfere. In another life, this small corridor of respect might have been the whole story between two nations. The logistic aftermath began before the last brass cooled. Officers counted rifles, sketched the field on scrap paper, estimated distances, recorded the angles of guns, as if math could later clean the page. A party was sent toward the Catholic Mission at White Clay Creek with word of trouble and a request for help that might be too late for most. The wagons creaked into the bowl and filled fast boards, thudding under new weight. The storm pinned everything down and promised to hide it by morning, to flatten what needed flattening, so that arguments could start against a cleaner sheet. Snow is a poor witness. It loves the equalizing work of the sky too much. What belief remained in the circle bent toward duty? The people who had survived began to choose living as an act of defiance. Language returned as instruction instead of prayer. Lift here, hold. There, do not let the wind steal this last heat. Remember the names, all of them. Everyone, do not let paper stand in for memory. Do not let the season excuse the weapons. A child who had not yet earned his adult name watched his aunt place a hand on his head and understood something wordless about staying. By the time the storm had finished its first anger, the ridge had gone quiet, except for sentries stamping their feet and a far horn at the agency that might have been answering a different day. The confrontation was over in the way that a fall from a height is over once you stop moving. But impact continues long after motion stops. The bowl held an echo that would not leave. The next work would be to read the wreckage out loud, to gather numbers into statements, to invent names for what happened that would make it palatable for those who needed it so. Others would call it by a shorter word and keep it there in the mouth, like a small stone. Morning had begun with a promise of order. It ended with a question that would follow the riders and the wagons and the law itself into the next valley. Snow does the first work of erasure, but it cannot keep up with the need to remember. In the hours after the guns relent, the valley learns a new choreography, lifting binding, naming, and the long drag of weight across ice toward Pine Ridge. Wagons arrive with their boards already cold, and each thud as a body is laid down feels like an argument made with wood and gravity. Those who can still move collect the living first, the moaning, the stunned, the children whose silence frightens more than wailing ever could. The wounded ride under quilts stiff with frost. The dead remain beneath a white that thickens by the minute, a ledger written in drifts and indentations. The storm takes the field for itself, but the people insist on rescuing what the sky would smooth away. The army arranges its aftermath in columns and rows. Officers count rifles and cartridge belts, sketch the position of guns, note distances as if geometry could absolve the day. Sentries stamp their boots along the ridge, while runners carry messages to the agency and the nearby mission. What they cannot calculate is the human echo. A camp that began as a circle of lodges ends as a scatter of families pulled apart by force and weather. A young woman who carried a child through the smoke now rides on a wagon plank, blood drying like black varnish on her sleeve. An old man who tried to lead two boys up the ravine crouches under a borrowed blanket, his hands shaking, trying to decide whether the tremor belongs to cold or to grief. Decision has left the field. Only consequences remain. The next day, the shock seeks new ground. Patrols fan out from the agency, and a clash ignites near the Catholic Mission at White Clay Creek, where the Seventh Cavalry and Lakota men trade fire among frozen willows and gullies that offer swift shelter and quicker ambush. To some officers, this follow-on fight proves what they wanted the first day, to mean that a hard hand was necessary, and that danger justified the iron on the ridge. To those inside the circle of grief, it is the same weather moving under a different cloud, an extension of fear that refuses to learn. By evening, the missionary bells have nothing left to say. People must bury their dead, even when the land argues against it. When the blizzard lifts burial details, soldiers and hired civilians pull sleds across the bowl bodies stiff as boards. The trench is cut into frozen soil with the slow brutality of dull tools and numb hands. A photographer arrives and fixes the day into images that will feel to later eyes both too distant and too near the ridge, with the guns quiet and the ground white. The cart piled with forms, the common grave with its saw-toothed edge. Memory will keep its own photographs too, images that do not fit a plate, the exact tone of a child's cry when a shell takes the air away, the weight of a name when spoken into a wind that does not stop to listen. Outcomes begin to stratify like layers in the cut bank. On the human layer, the cost is counted in kinship lines that suddenly kink or end. A girl who had 3 aunts has one. A man who was son and brother becomes the lone branch keeping a lodge upright. Infants who would have been named in spring are now stories told to keep a family from collapsing under the math. Survivors cluster at Pine Ridge, where agency buildings offer walls without warmth and rations without plenty. Physicians and missionaries work as far as their hands and beliefs will carry them. In this first week, the most precious resource is not flour or blankets, but the stubborn decision to speak to one another in the language that holds everything together. Words become tools again. They steady hands that must sew, cook, dig, bandage. They give shape to days that might otherwise dissolve. On the legal layer, reports rush ahead of truth because paper travels faster than wagons. An initial telegraph suggests a hard-won battle, a victory that could be tallied in captured arms and suppressed unrest. The word massacre enters the conversation almost immediately from observers who saw the field and could not reconcile it with the rhetoric. General Nelson Miles rides through and writes in the dry cadence of the inspector that what he finds is not a victory at all, that the women and children lying under the storm's work constitute a failure of command and a sin of policy. His letter cuts across the neatness of official phrasing like a ragged wind, and it will be quoted wherever anyone insists on keeping the day honest. Boards of inquiry will follow each a narrowing funnel that strains out blame until only the thinnest residue remains. Land law continues its silent labor beneath everything as relentless as frost. The Dawes Act does not reverse itself because of a winter valley. Allotments continue to fracture territory, and the surplus lands unassigned to individual parcels slide into the open hands of speculators and settlers. The people who survived Wounded Knee find that even grief requires permission slips, where to camp, how long to remain, how to move across a map that has become more fence than grass. A nation that calls itself orderly cannot imagine a way to share space without chopping it into little squares. Each square asks a family to live like an island that never joins. Culture bends but does not break. In the weeks after the burial, the drum returns soft at first because loudness now feels like a dare. Songs shift from calls to old victory, to calls for holding on. A grandmother teaches a girl to bead, not because there is leisure to make art, but because the rhythm of the stitch is a tiny bridge back to the world, where hands knew how to build instead of only carry. A boy repeats a prayer for safe crossing and realizes it still opens a door even when the room beyond holds only the living. The ghost dance itself crushed by the state's fear, and law's convenience survives in the quieter shape of memory and metaphor, a way to imagine that the line between the gone and the present is not a wall but a curtain that sometimes lifts. Numbers will be asked for because some minds demand them as proof that witness is not invention. The anchor that ends most arguments is simple and blunt. Roughly 250 to 300 Lakota were killed, most of them women and children, while 25 U.S. soldiers died, according to compilers such as Encyclopedia Britannica. The figures are not the point, but they protect the point from being erased by euphemism. Behind each digit sits a cradleboard, a name, a scar, a photograph that is careful not to blink. The ratio itself tells a story of imbalance that no rhetoric of mutual combat can tidy. Pursuit does not end at the edge of the battlefield. It takes the form of reputation and narrative. Newspapers far from the plains print headlines that make the Seventh Cavalry sound like men holding a dam against flood. And for readers with no maps in their heads, the story settles into template. In response, Lakota voices compose their own record. An Oglala man tells a white interviewer that soldiers chased women into the ravine and fired down into them. A Miniconjou woman tells how she pressed her baby to her breast and tasted ash on her lips. These fragments will not be cited in the ledgers of medals, but they will do the more durable work of guiding children toward an accurate memory of winter. When the agency school insists that English must be spoken to save a child, the child walks home and hears Lakota spoken low in the lodge, not as defiance, but as oxygen. Policy reacts as it always does, slowly, selectively, with more interest in guardrails than in repair. There are hearings. There are letters with letterheads. There is a phrase of regret that will one day make it into official language and feel to some like progress and to others like a second burial. Commanders defend their men. Subordinates swallow words they do not feel safe to say. The public tries on several names for the day and keeps the one that fits the least uncomfortably. In rooms where maps hang and the coffee is warm, the talk leans toward moving on. On the ridge above the creek, the wind remains the only speaker whose voice does not tire. Within the circle of the people, consequences are not abstract. They present themselves as choices that must be made by sundown. Who will ride the memorial trail when the snow returns? Who will carry the names to a stone? Who will petition the government not to repeat its celebration of an act the community knows as grief? Who will teach the next class of children how to say Wounded Knee in Lakota, and then how to say it in English, because the truth must live in both languages to survive in a country that often listens with only one ear? Survival becomes a curriculum. Plant this mend that sit here, learn this melody, carry this bundle. Do not let the law's sentence be the last word on your life. In the months that follow, the pursuit becomes subtler and in some ways harder to escape. It arrives as policy inspectors and missionary assessments, as new allotment maps and tighter ration schedules, as lectures that confuse obedience with safety. It also arrives as resilience. A rider carries a coal from one lodge to another so the fire never goes out between them. A youth who saw too much learns to break horses gentle and finds a steadiness in the slow bargain between animal and hand. An elder begins a winter count on a fresh robe and paints a spiral with a mark at its newest turn that is both a wound and a promise to remember. The valley holds what happened the way a body holds a scar, present sensitive, a guide for how to move without tearing it open again. Yet the scar is not the whole story. The tissue around it learns and strengthens. Across the plains, relatives at Cheyenne River and Rosebud and Standing Rock watch send word trade help and argue quietly among themselves about strategy, faith, and the best way to keep their children's names safe inside their mouths. These debates are not a weakness. They are a sign that the people intend to live long enough to disagree productively. By spring, the official narrative has hardened into print. The medals have been proposed for acts that officers name as gallantry under fire, and petitions rise from Lakota leaders and their allies asking the nation to look again to see the valley, not as a proving ground, but as a grave. The request is simple. Stop praising what grief still counts. The answer will not be simple. It will take decades to unfold, and the law will try to keep pace with memory while never quite matching its step. Somewhere between the ridge and the agency, the road turns toward courts and resolutions, toward hearings and words that lay claim to the past without relieving it. The next chapter will not be written by snow, but by signatures and speeches and the slow correction of names on plaques. If the morning at Wounded Knee ended with a silence shaped by wind and smoke, what follows tries to speak into that shape and learn whether a nation can say the right words in the right order and make anything better than paper. The first official word tried to make the valley neat. In early 1891, the Army convened inquiries that traveled across testimony like a skater over thin ice, pausing where the surface looked strong and passing quickly over places where it flexed. General Miles, who had walked the ground and seen what the storm did not yet conceal, condemned the conduct he found. Colonel Forsyth of the Seventh Cavalry was relieved, then reinstated after a court of inquiry declined to find fault strong enough to stick. Reports written for warm rooms called the event a battle. Letters written from colder places insisted it was not. The legal end state of that winter was an official shrug in the face of grief, a narrowing of accountability to the vanishing point. The Dawes Act did not bend under the weight of Wounded Knee. Allotment continued to cut the Great Sioux Reservation into smaller maps: Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Lower Bruley, while so-called surplus lands moved into non-native hands. The 1889 agreement that partitioned the old reservation remained the governing frame. What law did to land policy did to culture agents enforced bans on ceremony and schooling by punishment, while the ghost dance was filed away in reports as evidence of unrest, rather than a prayer for repair. In this sense, the political aftermath confirmed the logic that had brought the guns to the ridge. The state proved it could name and count and divide, even when counting meant adding absence to absence. Disputed points hardened into stories that nations told themselves. One debate clung to the first shot. Some insisted the accidental discharge of a single rifle made the slaughter that followed a kind of tragic inevitability, a domino line the Army was powerless to stop once it tipped. Witnesses from the camp and Miles himself argued the opposite, that an encirclement with artillery trained on families is already a decision, and that what followed was less accident than design. Another quarrel wrestled with the word for the day. Battle dignified the Army and made the field legible to those who needed symmetry. Massacre fit the facts as the survivors remembered them. Over time, the second term carried the greater moral weight and the wider scholarly consensus, but it took a century for official language to even approach the truth that communities had spoken from the start. There were gestures toward remorse that did not reach the families they purported to honor. Congress would eventually issue a broad federal apology to Native peoples as part of an Appropriations Act. More than a century later, words bound to a signature page, rather than to a change of law on the ground. Debates about the cluster of medals of honor, awarded for actions at Wounded Knee, rose and fell, in cycles a barometer of how willing the nation was to criticize its own myth. Petitions gathered signatures, bills were introduced, hearings rehearsed the same arguments about standards and context. The ribbon remained a ribbon, even as citizens and descendants insisted that valor has meaning only if a country names violence honestly. Memory organized itself in ways law could not anticipate. The Oglala Lakota and relatives across the plains carried the story forward, through winter counts painted on fresh robes, through testimony, set down in English and Lakota, both through family names repeated at the right moments in the right order. Each December, riders traced the trail that Spotted Elk's band had taken toward Pine Ridge, a memorial journey that held sorrow and instruction together in the same hand. At the graves, prayers and tobacco rose into wind that had learned to listen. The ride taught a younger generation how to turn history into care for horses for each other, for the land that had been made to carry too much. The 20th century brought another Wounded Knee that the nation could not ignore, the 1973 occupation at Pine Ridge, where activists seized the name as a shield, and a signal that the old grievances were still present tense. For many Americans, it was the first time they spoke the words in their living rooms. For Lakota families, it was a reminder that wounds carry forward unless policy learns to heal instead of to manage. Courtrooms and cameras framed the event as a standoff. Elders framed it as a long echo that refused to fade. The law responded with indictments and reports. The people responded with continuity. Museums, school districts, and universities slowly rewrote their placards and lesson plans. The photographs that once circulated without context gained captions that named the work of the guns plainly. Exhibits at tribal museums placed beadwork beside policy documents so visitors could see the absurdity of a government file arguing with a grandmother's meticulous stitch. The language of massacre entered textbooks not as a provocation, but as a correction. In some places, students learned the name Spotted Elk before the name Bigfoot, because the right name matters when you are restoring a person to their own story. Culture refused extinction. Ceremonies learned to live low, and then when it was possible to stand up again in public with the dignity of the unbent. Songs written after 1890 braided grief with instruction. The line that once called for victory learned to call for endurance and for the careful carrying of children's names into seasons not yet born. Language programs at Pine Ridge and other Lakota communities worked against time with the precision of the Hotchkiss crews and the tenderness of a kitchen table recording elders training teachers, building classes in schoolrooms where the alphabet now served a different master. Each new speaker became a small legal act the nation could not veto. In the courts, a larger land battle reached a symbolic high point in 1980 when the Supreme Court ruled that the taking of the Black Hills violated treaty promises and awarded money that the Sioux Nation refused on principle. The decision did not return land or repair Wounded Knee. It did, however, put the word unlawful beside an act the state had long treated as settled. The refusal of the money kept the moral claim alive and taught children that some forms of payment are not payment at all. Law in that moment admitted what memory had said for generations: not everything the nation did to the Lakota can be justified by necessity or forgotten by time. The present inherits both the paperwork and the drumbeat. You can stand at Wounded Knee today and see school buses pass with students who will learn the story from teachers who have learned to insist on names and numbers that match the witness. You can visit a language class and hear a child say creek in winter, and remember in Lakota, and you can watch an elder smile because the word for future is not an abstraction when it is spoken by a grandchild. You can open a newspaper and read once more that Congress is considering whether to rescind honors tied to a day that a nation has finally learned to call by its right name. You can attend a memorial ride and watch young riders hold a line against wind, with the quiet competence of people who expect to be here for a long time. Resolution, then, is the wrong word if it pretends to mean ending. The legal pieces have moved some, a little, some, not at all. The political vocabulary has improved in places and lagged in others. The land remains partitioned by fences the people did not ask for, even as they keep their own maps and stories, and in the route's hooves redraw every winter. Aftermath is closer to the truth if we understand it as the long-tail work of turning a place of breaking into a place of teaching. From here, the path bends toward continuance, toward the daily acts that keep a nation within a nation alive. And just beyond the ridge where the creek runs under ice, the next generation is already saddling their horses for December. The present does not just arrive here. It returns step by step with hooves and school buses and winter breath. On the ridge above the creek, the wind is still a low drum, but now it carries voices that have learned how to plant themselves in hard ground. At Pine Ridge, the day shifts between the practical and the sacred without apology. A clinic opens, a grandmother boils coffee, a drum circle gathers in a gym where the lights hum. A boy in a hoodie recites a proverb he learned last week and grins because he finally caught the rhythm of a vowel that seemed to run from him all summer. The valley does not forget what it held. It folds that memory into the daily pattern until memory becomes a kind of strength. Today, the people are here in numbers that follow both census and kinship, rather than the old calculus of disappearance. Families register children at tribal offices, enroll in programs, and show up for council meetings, where the arguments are the ordinary ones of any nation roads. Water schools spiked with the extraordinary pressure of doing all those tasks inside a history that still pushes back. Elders say a nation survives by practicing being one every day. The practice looks like a line of cars at a food pantry and a packed house for a high school game. It looks like an uncle teaching a teenager how to load hay. It looks like a nurse switching to Lakota so a patient can relax before the needle goes in. The roll call has never been a head count alone. It is a measure of how many people can still say we and know exactly who they mean. Language is a bridge that must be rebuilt while people are still crossing it. In classrooms at Pine Ridge and in community centers scattered across the plains, teachers work morning to evening with lesson plans that combine old songs, new apps, and the patience to celebrate every sound shaped correctly. Children mouth creak in winter and remember until the words fit their jaws, and elders correct gently and smile when a small sentence lands with the right balance. A language nest at a daycare sends home little sheets where parents can point to a spoon or a shoe and say the name out loud at bedtime. Each new speaker is a minor miracle and a major policy victory rolled into one. Events anchor the calendar to places that matter. Each December, riders gather for the memorial journey along the Bigfoot Trail, the route that Spotted Elk followed toward Pine Ridge. The horses stand steaming in the cold while someone prays and someone else checks a cinch. Then the line moves out across fields that remember every hoofprint. At the graves, tobacco and song rise into air that feels newly attentive. In summer, powwows turn open ground into arcs of color and sound, and visitors learn the courtesy of listening before asking. The year becomes a loop that holds both mourning and celebration, and the loop refuses to close on despair. Law keeps talking, sometimes with clarity, sometimes like a clerk looking for a file. In one line, Congress continues to debate bills that would rescind military honors tied to this place, a weather vane for how far the nation is willing to name the truth in its own handwriting. In one line, courts and councils revisit land questions that stretch back to Fort Laramie and forward to today, acknowledging in legal paragraphs what families have never forgotten at their kitchen tables. The language of policy moves slowly, but it moves, and those who care for this valley keep a hand on its shoulder and insist it look the place in the eye when it speaks. If the shock that opened this story was the sight of 4 guns aimed down into a winter camp, the echo now is quieter and more durable. It sounds like a classroom where a child reads a sentence in Lakota without stumbling and the room exhales. It sounds like a horse line jingling at dawn as the memorial ride forms up. It sounds like a council chamber where someone says we and everyone present knows the word includes the buried and the living. The creek that once carried panic now carries ordinary water under ice. And ordinary is not a small word here. It is the achievement. The ridge and the draw remain what they have always been, grass wind, a seam of moving water, but the people have changed the meaning stitched into them. Survivance is not a slogan. It is a pile of split wood, a lesson plan, a repaired fence, a name spoken correctly, a rider leaning into sleet because the route matters. The past refuses erasure, and the present refuses to be only aftermath. Standing in the cold, you can feel both truths settle on your shoulders like a blanket that has been passed down and is warm from many hands. The first light that once sliced the frost now opens the day gently. And the question that began this story, how a camp became a breaking, meets its answer in the fact of a people still here, speaking, writing, teaching, remembering. The work from here is simple and vast. Keep learning the names, keep telling the day straight, keep the fire moving, lodge to lodge, until every winter has light enough to read by. This isn't a period. It's an invitation. Say the names correctly, teach the truth, and carry the fire through winter. What concrete action can we take? Now, sign a petition, join a language class, or tell this story to a younger person. Comment with a small commitment you'll make. Thanks for watching.